This video is about government policy, who makes it and how it's made. So there are four main sources of government policy. The first and most obvious is the Prime Minister themselves, who enter that job with a clear agenda based on their own political convictions. So you can go as far back as Margaret Thatcher and her intention to privatise, her intention to reverse what she saw of years of decline in the 70s. You could look at David Cameron and the big society. And Rishi Sunak is trying to make the Conservatives, the party, wants more of competence and trustworthiness, but he's also got pressing issues like immigration that is one of his key priorities. And so the Prime Minister themselves is able to prioritise their key policies in the hope of leaving a legacy. Now that all comes down to Commons majority. Theresa May's intentions are much more difficult to make a reality in 2017 because she lacks a clear majority in the House of Commons. So it all comes down to majority. Rishi Sunak's in a situation now where he currently has a healthy majority in the Commons, but the next election is pointing towards a Conservative Party defeat. And so from that perspective, it looks like Rishi Sunak has a very short period of time at the moment, as it stands, to get his priorities in place. The second source of government policy is, of course, Cabinet. This is officially where proposals are discussed and debated, differences are resolved, and proposals can be rubber stamped if decisions have been made elsewhere. And Cabinet becomes more important in cases of divided parties and coalition government. And we'll come back to Theresa May and this idea that the Brexit process of 2017 to 2019 required the Cabinet to sort of make these decisions and to be on board in order to give this idea of party unity, because Theresa May could not afford a situation where there were regular rebellions. The third place is senior civil servants, and pictured there is Simon Case, who at the time of recording this video is the head of the civil service, has been in that role since 2020. He is the cabinet secretary, which makes him the Prime Minister's most senior policy advisor. Senior civil servants are able to offer advice and guidance to government ministers. They're crucial in implementing policy. They can speak truth to power, because sometimes prime ministers, it's all very well and good having their own ideas for what they would intend for policy, but they're able to advise on practicalities, legalities, and cost. They're not supposed to tell government ministers about the supposed rights and wrongs, but they're supposed to talk about how practical, legal, and costly policies will be. And they are not party political. Technically, they are unbiased and objective. In 2023, the release of Matt Hancock's WhatsApp messages embroiled Simon Case in something of a scandal, in which he was found in a text message exchange with the health secretary, joking about quarantine hotels during the pandemic. And that sort of brought into question his objectivity in his role. And the final place are our SPADs, our special advisors. Pictured on the left is Liam Booth-Smith, who is Chief Advisor to Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, who served with Rishi Sunak in the Treasury. He's a protege of Dominic Cummings, who was the key Chief Advisor to Boris Johnson. And so Liam Booth-Smith is essentially playing the role for Rishi Sunak that Dominic Cummings did for Boris Johnson. Remember that special advisors are handpicked by the Prime Minister. They're temporary civil servants, so they're not required to offer that balanced, unbiased advice. And quite often these individuals have a relationship with the Prime Minister that exists prior to them taking on that role. So some of Boris Johnson's SPADs had worked with him since his time as London Mayor, and of course Liam Booth-Smith worked with Rishi Sunak in the Treasury. And so these special advisors have a long-standing working relationship with the Prime Minister and can be a key source of policy ideas. So the second part of this video is how is policy made? And the textbook, and you can see it on pages 74 right the way through to page 77, sort of collects it in 5 places: personal, political, popular, external, and social. And we'll look at those individually now. So first of all, personal intentions, and I mentioned Margaret Thatcher before, and I'll mention her again. So people often refer to Thatcher as a conviction politician. She was dogmatic. She had a view of how the country should be run and what government should and should not do, and did her best to consistently stand by that. So on the left, you can see the council house policy. So Margaret Thatcher wanted to reduce the number of council houses and give people the opportunity to eventually own their own houses. There were nearly 5 million council rented properties at the start of Thatcher's reign. This reduced to less than a million in 1991 by the time she'd left office. So that shows that 4 million households were able to buy their council house in the Thatcher era. In the long term, what that's led to is a lack of social housing. On the right, we can see one of Thatcher's many attempts, and successful attempts, to privatise British industry. Now, critics will say that the industry was sold at a lower price than expected. However, this was a political aim for Thatcher. She didn't do it because it made economic sense in the short term. She did it because she believed ideologically that the government should have as limited a role in the economy as possible. So she sold off British industries such as British Telecom. But policy can also be the downfall of a prime minister. You can see in the centre, poll tax riots. Thatcher believed in a poll tax which would have essentially been a flat rate, which would have been more costly proportionally for the poor, but also for households that had more adults living in them. And it led to those riots. Eventually, it led to her downfall. And so sometimes being personally responsible for policy can have negative effects when things go wrong. Secondly is political. And quite often that is when things are promised in a manifesto or as the result of a coalition agreement. The manifesto pledge that I want to talk about is a Conservative Party manifesto from 2017, which pledged 33 hours of childcare for 3 to 4 year olds for households earning less than £100,000 a year. And the idea behind it was that it would get more parents back into the workforce and would be able to make sure that people in the workforce were paying back into the economy through taxation on their income. And speaking from somebody who benefits from that scheme, childcare can be ruinously expensive and can keep people, disproportionately women, out of the workforce after people have had children. And so this was designed to attract aspiring young families. Okay, next up, popular policy. And I think we can talk really about Brexit referendums here, because remember that referendums are advisory. The government does not need to act. And the Brexit referendum has dominated, well, it ended the prime ministerial era for David Cameron. It dominated Theresa May's time as prime minister. She was seen as the prime minister to get Brexit through. She led the Conservatives through the so-called Brexit election, in which she lost her Commons majority, and it was Brexit that eventually brought her downfall when she couldn't get a deal passed through Parliament. It then dominated Boris Johnson's time as Prime Minister. He won the 2019 general election on the promise of get Brexit done. And again, it dominated his time as Prime Minister. And even Rishi Sunak, after Brexit was supposedly done, had to redefine Britain's trading relationship with the EU, particularly with the status of Northern Ireland, in the form of what we call the Windsor Framework. And so referendums can have a significant impact on the agenda of a Prime Minister, and it can shelve certain plans and policies, and others will take centre stage. And the best example is the Brexit referendum of 2016, which dominated the era of May, Johnson. We forget Liz Truss, and of course even Rishi Sunak. Another example of popular pressure is not one that comes from sort of an official means in the form of a referendum, but from protest activity. So, the environmental campaigns of many groups, individuals as well as pressure groups, in an attempt to influence government policy. That's led the British government to commit to net zero emissions by 2050. And there's also a Secretary of State to commit to net zero. So not only has policy changed towards the environment, but cabinet positions have changed too. There is now a government minister responsible for making sure that the country is on track for net zero emissions in 2050. In 2019, Parliament approved a motion put forward by the government to declare a climate emergency. And so we can see here that government policy has been influenced by popular pressure. We mustn't forget external factors, and that is times of crisis. So, for example, policies such as lockdowns, social distancing measures, telling businesses when they could open, how many people they could have in their restaurant, distancing people in public spaces. All of those policies wouldn't have been things that the Conservative government would have wished to do in normal circumstances. And it was only the pandemic external crisis that changed policy there. And things like lockdowns, closing schools, insisting that people isolate after positive lateral flow tests. All of these policies emerged as a result of an external crisis, which of course was COVID-19. But other external factors can include foreign policy, and of course you can see there then Prime Minister Boris Johnson visiting Kyiv in the wake of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, and he went to meet Volodymyr Zelensky. And again, government policy adapts as a result of external factors, in this case, the invasion of Ukraine. And finally, social pressures on policy, and that is that attitudes in society change. In 1988, the Education Act told teachers working in schools they could not, and I quote, promote homosexuality. So things like same-sex relationships and same-sex identity could not be taught as part of a PSHE schedule. That law was in place until 2003. Now, society changes and attitudes change, which meant that in 2013, we get the Marriage Same-Sex Couples Act, which for the first time allows same-sex couples to have a legal marriage. Prior to that, same-sex couples could only be in receipt of a civil partnership, which didn't have the same status in law. But as the values of society change, government policy changes. The idea here with social pressures is that the government is reactive and reacting to changes rather than being proactive in its role.